I'm John from Adventure Shetland, and I'd like to welcome you to part 3 of our Spooky Shetland series, where we're delving into Shetland's history, folklore and traditions in the build-up to Halloween. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2 of the series yet, then I recommend you do so. Both videos are linked down there in the description if you want to check them out. They kind of give a bit more background and context to today's video. So on to that. Today is part 3, and I'm going to be telling a few Trowie tales from our folklore from various locations around these islands. So get yourself comfortable, arm yourself with a drink of choice, and let's crack into these stories. The first of our Trowie tales today comes from the northern island of Fetlar, and it's one of my absolute favourites. One evening, a young man was returning to his home in the eastern part of Fetlar. He'd been running an errand over in the west, and he was coming home, so it was in the evening time, and he was riding on a red mare and leading on a rope and a halter her grey foal. His road home took him past Stackaberg, which is a rocky outcrop with an ancient cairn on top, which was long rumoured to be a home of the Trows. And as he passed by quite close to the cairn, he heard a voice call out to him, although he didn't actually see anyone. But the mysterious voice had said this: "Thee it rides the red and rins the grey. Tell Tona Tivla that Fona Fivla is fan of the fire and brunter." Needless to say, the young man was a bit shaken by this disembodied voice coming from the hill, so he hurried home as quickly as he could from there. On his return to the house, his wife met him at the Brigstein, which is kind of the stone path outside the house, and she commented that he looked as white as a sheet, and he kind of gathered himself before recounting the tale of what had happened, saying that as he came past Stackaberg, this disembodied voice had called out to him, and he repeated the words that the voice had said: "Thee it rides the red and rins the grey. Tell Tona Tivla at Fona Fivla is fan of the fire and brunter." No sooner were the words out of his mouth than there was a shriek and a clatter from the byre, and a little Trowie woman burst out the door screaming, "Lesson do! That's my bairn that's fan in the fire at Stackaberg," as she disappeared out the gate and out the yard. The couple made their way into the byre, fearing the worst for their cow, because they knew what the Trows were like for stealing animals. But when they got through the door, they discovered the cow was in perfect health, but that the Trow woman had left behind a strange little copper pan full of milk, which she'd obviously been milking from the cow. Every morning after that, when they went to milk the cow themselves, they found that it had already been done. This copper pan was full with milk, and even though it was only a small pan, they never lacked. It was always enough for whatever they needed. And from that day forward, the couple found that they were always prosperous and lucky in everything that they did. Ollie was a crofter in Papastour, and every Christmas Eve he noticed something that confused him. His little boat, which he had always safely secured in the noost by the shore, would disappear. But every Yule morning when he went back down to check on her, she was always back exactly as he'd left her. At first this was a cause of grave concern and deep distress for Ollie, but as the years went on and the boat was always safely returned on Yule morning, that concern was replaced with more of a curiosity and a determination to find out what was going on and where his boat was going. When Christmas Eve rolled around again, he informed his wife that there was a task that required his immediate attention, and that he might be gone for a little while sorting it out, but this wasn't a reason for any concern. As the short day was drawing towards an early twilight, as happens in Shetland in December, Ollie made his way down to the noost and he hid himself underneath a sail at the stern of the boat, and he cut a tiny little hole, a little slit in the sail with his knife, just enough that he could see through, but enough that he could remain hidden. And he curled himself up under the sail and settled himself in. It wasn't long before he heard a few sets of quick, light footsteps coming down the beach, and he could hear the shords or the supports of the boat being removed, and he felt it being shoved down the beach towards the sea. Once the boat was afloat, the figures jumped aboard and arranged themselves on the tafts. Ollie could see through his hole in the sail 4 little men who he knew instinctively to be Trows. They arranged themselves on the tafts or the benches, and they began to row out to sea. Ollie stayed as still as he could manage under the sail, and he only risked a peep out every now and then. When he did, he could make out the shapes of these 4 little figures against the black, starry sky, and from the sounds of the waves breaking on the shore, he knew that they were rowing parallel to the Shetland mainland, but he couldn't tell where they were heading to. After a short while, the Trows stopped rowing, and the boat kind of glided into shore. It stopped with a jolt against something solid. The 4 Trowie figures hopped overboard again, and they tied the boat up. And once Ollie was sure they were all away, he peeped out over the gunwale to see a high cliff. The boat was tied to a rock at the foot of a steep cliff, which Ollie recognised to be the Head of Watsness, which is a significant distance from Papa. And he could see in the moonlight the 4 Trows standing at the base of the cliff, and 3 of them seemed to walk into it. Presumably there was a cave there, while the 4th one waited outside for them. They emerged again really quite quickly, and each of the Trows were struggling to carry a small barrel, and Ollie realised that this was them fetching their festive drams. He quickly hid himself back under the sail again, and the Trows quickly reboarded, and they stashed their kegs at the front of the boat, and they began the long row back to Papa. They reached the island again about midnight, and before departing, the Trows made very certain that the boat was shorted back in its noose exactly as they'd found it, as they always did. But to Ollie's surprise, they only unloaded 2 of the kegs that they'd placed aboard the boat. And as they clambered up over the rocks, away from the noose again, they finally spoke for the first time, saying, "One for the sleeper, one for the sleeper," as they kind of danced away with their drams between them. Once Ollie was certain that they were gone, he uncovered himself from the sail and stretched out and rubbed his tired and cramping limbs. And he got out the boat, reached back in to pick up the last keg, and carried it home over his shoulder. And Ollie was very grateful for his unexpected but generous Yule dram that year. One Yule evening, a young couple from Unst wished to join in with the festivities at their neighbour's house, but they didn't want their fun to be inhibited or limited in any way by their 2 children, and they had 2 young boys aged 3 and 4. So they bribed the boys with some extra cake and packed them off to bed early, and as soon as their sons were asleep, they ventured out next door to the neighbour's house. The neighbour's big barn had been cleared, ready for the dancing as it always was, and when the young couple arrived, they found that the dancing was well underway and the fiddler was playing with gusto. They joined in for a few reels before retiring through into the neighbour's house for some soup and some bannocks, and no doubt a dram or 2. Meanwhile, in the barn, 2 little boys had entered wearing nothing but their nightshirts, and their bright blue eyes were wide with excitement, huge grins on their faces, from lips which didn't say a single word. Their sudden appearance in the barn had brought kind of amusement and gathered a few shouts from the folk that were there. But an old man said, "Nah, come do a wine, boys. You'll hear a dance like abody other." And so the fiddler struck up a reel. So the boys began to tread the boards, and their little bare feet were keeping perfect time. And they began to dance such wonderful steps that the folk there kind of commented on it, saying, "Oh, this boys must have been taught by the Trows." And obviously the Trows are well known for their love of a dance and a spree. Just as the dance was kind of reaching its height, The young mother returned back into the barn, and catching a glimpse of the two little dancers, she said, "Good God, my bairns!" Trows can't stand a pious word, and as soon as they were said, the two little dancers disappeared into the crowd of folk that were gathered by the door. And a few jokes and insults even were hurled at the mother for startling the two little boys, but she insisted that her sons were tucked up at home in bed, and with that, the mood changed. The young parents rushed home to try and find where their boys were, but to no avail, and in the bed where the boys should have been sleeping, they found two logs lying there. Everyone spent the next few hours looking for the boys, but with no success at all. And it was at that point that folk really began to speculate about the nature of the steps that the boys had danced, and the fact that they'd maintained this strange silence the whole time they were there. At last an old maid from the village asked the mother, "Did you look well to the saying?" To which the young man replied, "No, I forgot what needed to be done. I never even thought of it." With this, everyone knew it was the Trows who had taken the form of the boys at the dance, and there was no more dancing that Yule, to say the least, and none for many, many Yules after that in that community. The following morning, the two boys' bodies were found dead in each other's arms in a snowdrift by the peat bogs, just a couple of 100 yards from the home. It was a terrible tragedy, and one that everybody agreed came about as a result of the parents neglecting to send their bairns at Yule. There was a woman from Unst named Kirsten for Dice, and she died at the birth of her first child. Or at least that's what everyone thought. Shortly after her death, another young woman in the district said that Kirsten appeared to her in a dream, and she had some strange words for her. And in the dream she'd say, "I hae the milk of your coo that you couldna get, but you'll hae mair as that if you'll gie me what you'll ken about afore lying." And the young woman didn't promise anything, because frankly she had no idea what Kirsten was on about. But soon she realised that it was a child of her own that Kirsten spoke of, and when the child was born, she named her Kirsten for Dice. Shortly after the baby girl was christened, the original Trow-bound Kirsten appeared to the mother in another dream and explained that all in the family would prosper so long as the young Kirsten remained in it. She also said that she was quite comfortable with the Trows, but that she could be rescued and brought back if someone who loved her happened to see her and had the presence of mind to mention God's name when they did. She also told the young mother that her family had forgotten to sain her when she'd given birth to her child, and that was how she'd come under the Trows' power in the first place. Prosperity came like a high tide on the family. That was up until the young Kirsten grew up and got married and left her mother's home. On her wedding night there was an almighty storm, the likes of which hadn't been seen in living memory. But from that day forward, from that wedding day, the mother's fortunes changed significantly for the worse, and all the luck went to the young Kirsten instead. A man named John Nisbet saw the original Kirsten once as well. He was up walking in the dal or the valley near her old home when a hole opened up in the hillside. He looked in and he saw Kirsten sitting in a strange looking armchair, but it had a red hot iron bar across the front which prevented her from getting up. She was sitting in a brown silk gown, which from John's description the folk knew to be Kirsten's wedding dress. On seeing her neighbour, Kirsten cried out, "Oh Johnny, what sent thee?" To which his reply was, "Peace be present. Kirsten, what keeps thee here?" And she said, "Well, I'm odious happy, but I canna win out for a mitten their mate." Unfortunately, John either didn't know or forgot to say the name of the Almighty at that moment, and in an instant the whole scene disappeared, and John Nisbet found himself standing knee-deep in the bog at the edge of the dell. Our final tale today is probably one of the most well-known Trowie stories in Shetland folklore, but it's definitely one that's worth telling again here. Tammy was a crofter and a fisherman who stayed with his family in Oya in North Maven. It had been a particularly long and hard winter with really rough weather, so much so that the men weren't able to get out fishing, and by February the food supplies were running pretty low. Eventually though, there came a break in the weather, and Tammy, along with his dad and his brother, decided that they were going to make the most of it, so they launched their little boat and went to their kind of reliable fishing grounds at the south end of the Lion Clody Wick. Just as they were arriving, they noticed another small boat coming up towards them from around the Grunestact, which is just near the north end of the Lang Air. And they decided that they would draw in alongside this boat and catch up on the news, as not much had reached them all the way out in Oya. The boat had come from Headgear, but two of the men aboard were from Hillswick, and they'd actually been coming north to fin Tammy and to speak to him, to ask him if he would play his fiddle at a wedding that was to be held in Hillswick the following Thursday. It was quite common in 19th century Shetland for weddings to be held on a Thursday, and they were usually held in the winter as well. The Hillswick wedding was to be a lavish affair by all accounts, and there were going to be 4 fiddlers playing at it, and Tammy was only too happy to accept this invitation. They returned home that night with a successful catch of fish, which they shared around their neighbours, and the weather remained fine for the rest of the week, so they managed to get a lot of fishing done. On the Wednesday night, Tammy had set out his clothes and his fiddle ready to go first thing the next morning. After rising early and getting a good breakfast in him, Tammy shouldered his fiddle case and he made for the door. Little did his family know this would be the last they would see of him for a very long time. Tammy went first to a neighbour's house, and they took him in their small boat and they slipped him off at the Blade of Headgear in Ronisvoe, and he had another meal with a family in Headgear before making his way over to Hillswick and the wedding that he was to play at. The neighbours then returned to Oya and relayed their news to Tammy's family. They said that they'd slipped him off, but they'd also agreed that they were going to pick him up again from the Blade in Headgear at exactly the same time the following day and take him back home again. The weather wasn't playing ball though. A big swell in the sea made a boat journey far too dangerous, but the family weren't too worried because they knew that Tammy wouldn't set out unless it was safe to do so. After a few days, the weather relented and the sea calmed enough for the boys to set out from Oya to Ronisvoe again. When they arrived at Headgear, they were informed that Tammy had actually crossed the sheltered Voe the night before and gone to stay with friends at a house on the north side called Fale. More disappointment met them at Fale though. With it having been a bright moonlit night, Tammy had insisted that he was going to walk home, and he said that he knew every inch of ground from Ronis to Oya, and the folk at Fale had deemed themselves powerless to stop him from setting out. After some deliberation, it was decided to head back to Oya, and when they did, Tammy's brother Robbie jumped off of the boat and he raced back up to the house, as Tammy should have been home by then. But once he arrived at the house, there was no sign of him, and then the family kind of started to panic. Over the next few days, a thorough search was carried out all over North Maven from Ronisvoe up to Fetlar, and there was no sign of Tammy anywhere. They kept searching for 2 or 3 more days, and passed over everything a few times, but eventually they realised that Tammy wasn't going to be found. The family went into mourning, and a great void opened up in their lives, and time began to pass very, very slowly. Yule rolled around, and while it's normally a joyous and happy time of celebration, it was met with sadness in Oya that year. January brought storms, and in February came the snow, and it was now a full year since Tammy had gone to play at the wedding in Hillswick. The following morning, the men were up on the hill checking on the sheep, and Tammy's sister was out fetching water from the well. and while she was making her way back to the house, she noticed someone coming across the face of the hill, but as she had work to be getting on with, she didn't really take any notice of it. A short time later, as she was sweeping the kitchen floor, she heard the latch lift on the door. So she peeped up, and who should she see but Tammy striding into the room. She froze and let out an almighty scream, which alerted her mother and her neighbours, who came rushing in from the byre. Tammy was stinking of alcohol, and he was absolutely peluvious. He was hammered, but he was still wearing the same clothes he had set out in, but he had a brand new fiddle case over his shoulder. His mother took one look at her returned son and she fainted at his feet. She was helped up into a chair, and it was decided that Tammy should be taken to bed to sleep off his stupor. So they led him through, and soon he was gently snoring away. News of the return spread quickly, and it wasn't long before the men had come back from the hill, and a number of the neighbours had come around as well to see if the rumours were true. There were a couple of questions on everyone's lips. Firstly, where on earth had Tammy been for a year and a day? And secondly, as Tammy was a known teetotaler, how had he gotten so drunk? An old neighbour said it would be best if Tammy was just left to sleep and he would wake again in his own good time. Eventually he did, at dinner time the following day, and he rubbed his eyes and looked around, and the family then came in to see him. His mother was the first to ask where he'd been, and Tammy replied by saying, "Well, I'm played at twa weddings. There was een in Hillswick, and the second een, I can't mind what the second een was." His brother realised he had no idea how much time had passed, so he sat down and explained how they'd gone eventually to hail her and then to fail to fetch him, to find that he'd already set off, and that this was actually a whole year later. It came as a shock to Tammy as much as to everyone else to learn that everybody had thought he was dead for a whole year, and so his mother decided that the best thing to do would be to get him a plate of food, and she brought him some mutton and some bannocks, and he started to munch away, and he ate like he'd never seen food in a long time. As he was gorging himself on this mutton bannocks, something seemed to click in his mind, and he slammed his knife down on the table. He remembered setting off from Fail, heading for the back of Colliford Hill, and then across the burn of Roarwater. From there, he would follow the Bjorgs of Skelbury north, before turning west along the southern slopes of Safety Hill, keeping well to the north of Pettidale Water. And from there, it was just a case of following the burn down the Lee and back to Oya. His journey was going well until he crossed the burn of Roarwater, at which point it began to snow heavily, and he decided he would take shelter behind a big grey stone that he'd come across. Just as he was about to set off again, he thought he heard a voice calling out his name. So he paused for a moment, and sure enough, there it came. He heard the call, "Tammy, wait! Dinna go until I'm spoken today." And Tammy, whether through fear or something else, he felt like he couldn't move, so he stayed exactly where he was. And that was when he saw him. No more than 10 feet away was a strange little man that Tammy had never seen before. Before Tammy could even say a word, the little man said to him, "Dinna be fair, Tammy boy. I see there's a fiddler, and I was just wondering if they would play at my sister's wedding." He then handed Tammy a small stoneware flask and invited him to take a drink to keep the cold off. Tammy did, and as soon as the liquid was in his mouth, he could feel it warming up his whole system from the inside. The Peary man then led Tammy across to another big stone, where they were met by another 4 of these small people, and they kind of arranged themselves around Tammy, and walking like that, the 6 of them could travel as though they were completely unhindered by the weather, which by now was a blind moorie. They came next to a huge stone which resembled a grey face, but it had light kind of emanating from behind it, and they crept in through a small gap at the side of the rock, and Tammy was surprised to find that they were in the midst of a huge party. It surprised, and no doubt relieved Tammy, that all the Peary folk there were really friendly towards him, and some of them even knew him by name, and kind of greeted him as they bid him welcome. And all around, the young and old were all sat together, and they were eating and drinking and singing and dancing away. An old man with a snow-white beard and moustache laid Tammy over beside the fire, and he sat him down at the table. And he produced for him what looked to be the back leg of a sheep, and a plate of tatties and another bigger flask, and he instructed him to eat and drink plenty because there was a lot of work to be done. Tammy cleared the plate and drained the flagon, which he thought tasted kind of like homebrew, but didn't seem to have any effect on him. And after he'd finished, he got out his pipe and lit it. And at this point, the man with the snow-white whiskers came back over, and he introduced himself as Aussie, and explained that it was his youngest son's wedding today, and that they'd heard of Tammy's talents on the fiddle. Tammy took the hint, and he brought the fiddle out from its case. He then announced to the crowd that he was going to play a tune for the bride and groom, and he launched into the fuller reel. All of the little folk got up to dance, and they danced the reel, and as Tammy played more, they danced the flugga and the parm and the bursting reel. Even old Aussie and his wife, they were up and about, and they even danced dances that Tammy had never seen before. Both Tammy and the hill folk were appreciative of each other's talents, with a lot of compliments being passed back and forth between the two. And he played and danced for the rest of the night. Eventually, old Aussie clapped his hands and said that that would be an end of it for this night, but to come back in the morning, for there would be plenty more feasting and drinking and dancing again. The newlyweds came over at this point and thanked Tammy for his memorable contributions to their big day. And just as Aussie was coming over to do the same, he stumbled and he tripped and he fell, and he landed crack on the tap of Tammy's fiddle. There was a twang and a crack as the string snapped and the fiddle was laid in two. Aussie gathered up the remnants and chucked them on the fire before Tammy even had a chance to intervene, and at this point the young man was on the verge of tears. He'd gotten that fiddle from a neighbour when he was at the age of 6, and it was just shortly before the neighbour had died, and Tammy really had precious little else that he could really actually call his own. Aussie went to the press and he rummaged around for a moment before reappearing with a brand new fiddle case, which he presented to Tammy, apologising that he would never have broken his fiddle on purpose, but his old legs were failing him in his old age. The new case contained not only a brand new fiddle, but it also had 3 bows and replacement strings, bridges and pegs, and also some new rosin for him. It was a more than adequate replacement, and Tammy was really quite reluctant to accept it. By this time, most of the Peary folk were asleep on little straw mats on the floor, but Aussie led Tammy through into another room which had a box bed in it. Tammy was trying to explain that he would need to get home because his family would be wondering where he was at, but Aussie explained to him that it was still snowing heavily outside, and they should go to sleep and see what the next day brought. The next he remembered was being woken for breakfast by an old woman that he recognised to be Aussie's wife, and she was calling him through for breakfast. The feasting began then at breakfast time but continued all day, and they had mutton and beef and various kinds of fish, tatties, bannocks, soup, everything you could possibly want, and there was also plenty of drink as well. Aussie frequently checked the weather from the door, but it was still snowing heavily and still drifting, but he still nonetheless feared that Tammy would think he was being trapped, so he took him over to show him himself, and once Tammy had seen the weather, he realised that it would be madness to try and set off for home. As the day wore on, more and more of the Peary folk began to appear, and Tammy didn't need much persuasion to try out his new fiddle. As he played, he found that his fingers began to play tunes almost by themselves, and they were tunes that he'd never even heard before, but his hosts all seemed to know what they were. And he felt like the fiddle was like a living thing in his hands, and that he could play for twice as long before he began to feel tired. Tammy was just about to head for bed at the end of the dancing when, again, the bride and groom came up to him and thanked him again for the contributions that he'd made. They were heading off in the morning to go and head a long distance away, and that they wouldn't see him again, but they thanked him for all that he'd done for them. Tammy and Ossie smoked out the last of their pipes for the night, and Ossie reassured Tammy that the weather would be clear enough the following morning for him to head home. So again, he should go and get some rest. And the next Tammy knew, he was being woken for breakfast the next day. After sharing a feed of porridge and milk and roasted scallops washed down with ale, Ossie attached a string or a rope around the fiddle case so that Tammy could carry it over his shoulder like he had done his original one. The fiddler was then provisioned with a pail of bannocks and brownies, and Ossie then presented him with a fine china flask of the ale which he had grown to love. Two of the same little men who had led Tammy to the wedding then appeared, and one of them took him by the hand like a child and led him out into the day. It was incredibly misty, so much so that Tammy could only see the tassels on the little men's hats, and even though he wouldn't want to admit it, he was actually really glad that they were there to lead him. After walking for a good while, the mist began to lift a little bit, and the three sat down and they shared the bannocks and the brownies from the pail, and they drank a good portion of the ale from their flasks. Once they were finished, they got up again, but this time the little men didn't take Tammy by the hand, and instead they let him walk ahead. In moments the mist had lifted completely and the sun shone bright in the winter sky. In front of them was the slopes of the safety hill, and Tammy turned to thank his little companions for leading him this far. But as he turned, he was astonished to see that they were gone. There was absolutely no sign of the little men who just moments before had been mere steps behind Tammy. It was as though the ground had swallowed them up. Tammy didn't get very far when he was overtaken by a terrible thirst, and so he sat down and he drained the flask of ale again, and that was the last thing he could remember before he woke up in the bed that day. At this point, Robbie asked, "Where is the flask, Tammy?" But Tammy said he had absolutely no idea if he hadn't brought it home with him. And at this point he instinctively reached for his fiddle and he began to play, and without instruction or knowing what the tune was, the folk just began to dance automatically almost. And it was always said from that day forward that if Tammy was playing the fiddle, you just had to dance. Nobody else would touch the fiddle though, for fear that it was bewitched. The following day, a neighbour by the name of Monty Tulloch was out on the hill and he came across the flask, but to his surprise, it was full. He brought it back to Tammy and they realised then the flask was self-replenishing. You could drain it absolutely dry, but if you set it aside for a while, when you returned it would be full. Tammy's mother was very superstitious though, and she wouldn't allow it to be kept in the house, so it had to stay out in the byre. But every year from then on, the cows had good calves, the sheep had good lambs, the land grew good crops, and the men always seemed to do well at the fishing. Many, many years later, Tammy and Robbie and all of the other male neighbours set off to Runnisvoe for another season at the half fishing. Tammy and Robbie were working on different boats that year, and this was to be the last time that Tammy was seen by his family. It was the 20th of July and Robbie's boat was ashore, but Tammy's was off, and they were caught in a freak storm. In that storm, 10 boats and almost 60 men were lost from the north of Shetland, and it became known as the disaster of 1881. and all of those men are commemorated in the Gloop Memorial up in Yale. And hardly a family in the north of Shetland wasn't affected by the tragedy. A time later, Tammy's sister was on Safety Hill when she came across a neighbour who was crew on another boat which was out on the same day as Tammy's, but had managed to survive the devastation of the storm. He told her that Tammy's boat had been capsized by a huge wave, but that Tammy was clinging onto the keel of the upturned boat when something strange happened that he would never forget so long as he lived. He said that a strange little boat came across, crewed by 4 small men, and the boat looked as though it was rowing on a mill pond. It wasn't really affected by this devastating storm that was going on. These 4 little men pulled Tammy aboard, and then they disappeared behind a wave in the devastation of the storm. Tammy had always said that if Ossie needed a fiddler, he would come and find him, but the family always just assumed he was joking. But truth looked to be on the safe side. When she got home again, Tammy's sister searched the house and the byre for the fiddle and the flask, but neither of them could be found. So thank you for watching this 3rd instalment in our Spooky Shetland series. That's been a long one today, but I hope you've enjoyed these Trowie tales. I've certainly enjoyed telling them to you. Don't forget to like and share this video wherever you can, and if you don't want to miss another one in this series and beyond, then click the subscribe button, it's down there, and ring the little bell to stay notified. All of the social media links are down there in the description as well, if you'd like to keep up with us on a day-to-day basis, and the links to the merchandise stores are down there as well. Any money that you do spend there goes directly into supporting me and the company through the winter, and it is very greatly appreciated. For anything else you might need, tours, the blogs, all of those sorts of things, it's adventureshetland.com. But that's all really for me today. I'm John from Adventure Shetland, thank you for watching, and I will catch you again next time for more Spooky Shetland adventures. Cheers.